How do we raise racially aware children in post-1994 South Africa? Adam Catzavelos' family fired him from the family business after a video of him making racist remarks went viral. But is that the solution? That's our conversation tonight. And remember, you can get involved. You can give us a call. Joining me is journalist Asanda Ngoasheng and parent Lucian Oakley-Smith. Good to have you both with us. Let me start off with you, Asanga. How do we bring up non-racist children?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is that we need to do the opposite of what a lot of parents do. So a lot of parents think that the way to raise non-racist children is to train our children not to see race. But we actually need to do the opposite. We need to teach our children that there is this thing called race in society and that it does have a negative impact on various members of our society. Because when you teach your children to be colorblind or to not see race, what you're essentially doing is you're training them to erase the experience of their friends, of people that they know who get negatively impacted by the existence of racism.
And how do you get them to see race in the right way?
Well, I think children don't need to be trained to see race. Children see race. It's just that parents, whenever the conversation comes up about race, a lot of parents get very nervous and they kind of try and divert or not have the conversation, in the same way that a lot of parents run away from topics like sex, for example. So what we need is for parents to be bold and to be honest about, you know, this is the country that we live in, this is the history that we have as a country, and this is how this history that we have as a country affects the people living in this country at this particular moment. So, for example, as a black parent, I teach my child that there is a history of apartheid, and this is how this history of apartheid affects us. And so when she learns at school that, you know, there's this person called Nelson Mandela who, you know, who was in jail for fighting for the freedom, I sit and I explain to her what that means, and I sit and explain to her what it was that Nelson Mandela was in jail for, and I explain to her that there were this group of people who didn't believe that this group of people was, you know, was who had the right to be in the country, and treated them in a very bad way. And I explain it obviously in very child sensitive and child appropriate ways and age appropriate ways. And I think that's what a lot of parents need to be doing, because if I'm teaching my child as a black parent to do this, then I believe that white parents should be teaching their children in the same way, so that when my child and their child meet, they're able to have conversations and be able to engage with an understanding that there's a history and the background of this country, and this is how it affects all of us collectively as a nation.
Okay, Lucian, you've been nodding away there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Asanda touches on a number of key points, and I think tonight I'm going to focus very much on what I know, which is my kind of lived experience as a white South African, as a father and as a Muslim. And I think that race remains so much of a holy cow for us in terms of discussion as white parents. I think it comes packaged with an incredible amount of fear. I think it comes packaged with a feeling of inadequacy. We are inheritors of one of the grandest social experiments in the history of humankind in terms of division and exclusion.
And do you think whites don't know how to talk about it?
I think it's part and parcel of the challenge, is that we ourselves are not racially aware adults, and it's not something that is going to sort of fall from the sky like manna from heaven. I think we, you know, to cast a negative light, we very often are loath to kind of see that statistical and historical truths don't necessarily have to apply to us, although they may, in the main, as individuals. And that fear often of having that conversations with one's child is understandable, but the cost almost of not having that ability and not grappling with that ourselves as parents is foundational to the problem, I think, in many ways.
Do you think there's a fear that talking to children about racial issues might make them racially aware, whereas before they might not have noticed?
I think it goes back to this, to what Asanda was saying, in terms of how we'd rather not look at it. We'd rather not unpack it for fear of the fact that discussion of race in itself is something that racial awareness is a problem. Racial awareness is probably exactly what we require to be able to have the sort of meaningful dialogue as a country that we need to move ourselves collectively in the right direction. I often look at it and I see not only a kind of unwillingness, but a deep kind of almost a wanton ignorance sometimes. That I battle personally to find the source of, but I'm definitely aware that if we don't take the challenge on ourselves as those people who are raising children, it becomes almost impossible to be a guiding light for them in terms of their own awareness and how to navigate that world. And I don't want us to talk about that for the whole evening, but I did think it was a foundational part of the problem, is that we ourselves grapple with something. So it's
Sanda, when it comes to, I've just come back from Qatar, and there was a lot of conversation in school about the color of children's skin. They'd call them peach or, you know, different color. I mean, does that start playing into the system? Should it be a bigger awareness of what you're dealing with, a more culturally sensitive awareness?
I think that, again, a lot of parents hear that in their sort of kind of bulk. So the first thing is just to prove to you that children are... We as parents need to understand that from the day that children are born, society is sending them messages about the race that they're in or the skin that they're in and about the skin of others. So children are born, and more often than not, if they have a nanny, that nanny is black. And if that child is white, they see their parents, they see how their parents react or treat their nanny. They see how their parents react or treat their gardener. They see how their parents react or treat people in service who happen to be black in this country. They see how their parents treat people who are white, who happen to be, you know, bosses and who happen to be in higher positions in this country. And so already before a child has even actually developed the language that is required to have racial conversations, the society has already told them, you know, that this is what being black is and this is how you treat black people. Their parents themselves are not even aware necessarily at the time that they themselves are sending racist messages about how to treat black people, about how to talk to black people, and about how to begin having dialogues with black people. So by the time you're actually having a verbal conversation with your child, you need to be aware that that child already has a lot of messages that you as a parent then have a responsibility to unpack. And so by the time a child comes to you and starts talking about peach skin and starts talking about brown skin, that then becomes your opportunity to enter into the conversation and explain to them, why do we physiologically, biologically have different skin, and explain to them the importance of melanin and why some people have melanin and why people don't have melanin, and then explain to them that we live in a society that although as humanity we should be treating each other equally, and although as humanity we should be seeing each other as equal, but that there are people in our society who see the presence of melanin as a problem, and who see the presence of melanin as an indicator of not being smart, as an indicator of a whole lot of things. So that when your child, you know, receives these further messages from society about melanin and about the lack of melanin, then your child is actually ready to engage with that, and your child is actually ready to engage properly. Because the problem with not teaching our children race is that as black parents, if we don't teach our children about race, they won't be able to identify when they are victims of racism, and they will begin to believe that they are being bullied or they are being treated in a certain way because of them. They won't understand that it could be because of their race or the skin that they're in. And as white parents, if we're not having that conversation, they are going to, you know, speak to children of color, and they are going to say things to children of color that are inappropriate, and then parents get shocked when they land up in the principal's class, in the principal's office, being told that their child said something that was completely inappropriate, and they feel they didn't teach their children that, but actually by not teaching them, you are essentially teaching them.
Let me jump in here. I mean, the reason that we're talking about this topic, I mean, it's obviously relevant, but I was just going to go to that horrible tweet that the South African did that's gone viral. There it is. Can we just listen to it again quickly?
Let me give you a weather forecast here. Blue skies, beautiful day, amazing sea, and not one inside. Heaven on earth. You cannot beat this. You cannot beat this.
Doesn't matter how many times you hear it, it's incredibly shocking. I'm just going to bring in Simon from Cape Town. Go ahead, Simon.
Hi, I'd just like to...
Go ahead, Simon.
Hi, I'd just like to say I believe that racism to a large extent is born in the family environment, and it's probably brought down from parent to child. So my question is enough being done in the schools to educate children about racism and help them to integrate more with different races and different cultures?
Thank you, Simon. Lucien?
I would love to say yes. I think that I'm kind of, I think what people call now a zennial. I'm sort of at the cusp of Generation X and a millennial. So I always have this lens that says, where do we come from versus where do we want to go? So in terms of post-democratic South Africa, I think there's a lot more effort in terms of building the conversation, creating the right kinds of exposure. As Asanda was saying, creating the right kind of environments for same-status relationships between children of different races and what have you. But I think that it still remains a statistical anomaly where you find a school or a school governing body actively invested in a program of, be it transformation, be it diversity, be it serious inclusion. And I think having worked with a lot of those sort of bodies to varying degrees, I see and I feel the frustration of parents, and one almost sort of asks the question, where does this conversation end? We have these conversations in the workplace, we have them on our WhatsApp groups in our communities, we have them when we get to school because, and I think it comes from a good place. I think there's a place of aspiration where people realize there's a lot more that we could be doing. But I think the evidence speaks for itself in terms of the society.
Okay, well, there's an example.
Particularly in terms of somebody that I could have grown up with and been a peer of. And
do you agree with these parents for standing back and saying this was disgusting, got nothing to do with us, we're kicking him out of the family business? Is that the right way to do it? Could they be free from blame here?
I think there are two sides to it. And I think it's almost linked to what I said just now. I think, what is enough in that circumstance? I mean, we've criminalized that kind of language in South Africa, and I think that one must. We see situations every day in terms of how difficult it is for a family to distance themselves for somebody for some massive moral incursion or the other. And I think that in this case it's no different, and I think the family have been incredibly brave. I think time will tell whether or not it's gesture and what have you, but I think for once we actually, on the positive side of it, see representatives of, we'll say the white community standing up amongst each other, saying this is really not okay. We're not okay with this, and there need to be consequences for it. And I think that's a step that will hopefully bring about some faith in people who are looking at this conversation from the outside, who think that we're possibly entirely tone deaf to what's going on around us. So on the one hand, I really do salute them. I think it's an uncommon thing for a family to publicly chastise but given the depth of it, I think that one has to also have a conversation around is this a kind of blood curse that we carry as white South Africa, and where do we draw the line for the sake of our own children?
And as Sanda, I'm just wondering what sort of role social media plays when it comes to dealing with your children, and if a child had seen that horrible video, what the conversation would be.
Well, I always think of it as I made an example before with the conversation around sex. When things come up, that is when you should be, as a parent, unfortunately, you're not going to get a forewarning, but you should sort of stay ready to have these conversations with your children. You should also be starting these conversations with your children so that by the time they engage with social media or any other content, they are ready, and they have the language, and they have the dialogue that's required for such conversations. What we normally do in South Africa is that we sort of throw children to the wolves, and we don't give them the tools, and then we get shocked when they do things like, and I mean, we're not talking about a child, we're talking about an adult, but his parents know that's how he thinks. I don't think that was the first time that he has said those words. He sounded very familiar with the term. That was not the first time he was saying it. And what has been reported is that it was coming from a closed WhatsApp group, and then somebody from that WhatsApp group then leaked it. So what that means is that he is living in an environment that breeds this kind of language. He's living in an environment that encourages and has not called him out on this language. And so it becomes important, unfortunately, particularly for white South Africans, to take responsibility for ridding this country of racism by calling out relatives, by calling out family members, and by calling out acquaintances. Because when you don't do that, you are teaching your children that the use of the K word is okay. You are teaching your children that treating other people's children or adults with prejudice is okay. And I mean, for me, it starts with something as simple as grown women Grown mothers, grandmothers are being called boys are being called girls because they happen to be domestic workers. Grown men are being called gardeners because are being called boys because they happen to be gardeners. We need to start there. We need to start with the ways in which we use our language, because we use our language around our kids, and then our kids start thinking, hey, but we don't call uncle whoever who's the same age as this woman a girl, a boy, and we don't call aunt whoever who's the same age as this person a boy. And so children pick up on those cues, and as I said, we live in a very racialized society, and we shouldn't be surprised when children pick up on that.
Let me take this back to Lucian. I mean, we do live in a very racially aware society, a very racist society still. When you've got something like Twitter, which is pretty, vile here in South Africa, incredibly racist, is it something you should filter from your children? Is it something that you've got to keep away from them? And where does that filtering start and where does it stop?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer categorically in terms of does one filter Twitter from one's children. I think that social media, although very enticing, is a very bad gauge of a society. I think it does represent a necessary extreme for children to be aware of in terms of a conversation. I think that your intuition as a parent, would kick in as it would around anything, like, foul language but translating the messages to them that are spoken about on social media as one end of the discussion, I think is probably healthy. I think the level of exposure is where the conversation probably comes alive. But to absolutely filter, I think we go back to the ground that Asanda laid for us earlier on, in terms of this kind of protective bubble where we're not really preparing them for the reality that awaits them when
Asanda and Lucian, thank you very much. It was great to talk to both of you.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Jane. Yeah.
Thank you. Up next, a press conference at the US State Department. We are live in New York after this.